everybody. So if we could just start recording, thank you so much. Lifesaver. Okay, welcome everybody for those who might just be coming in as well to Disrupting Latinx Literature in the Classroom. And as I said, I'm Dr. Marilisa Jimenez Garcia. So these are the questions that went out, right? Like we've been sending questions out with each one of these workshops, and specifically who our teachers are and who our educators are that are going to be presenting. But these are the questions that went out, and it was about learning more about the Disrupt Text movement, which Lorena is here to talk more about. She's the founder, one of the key founders of that movement. And then specifically, how does Latinx literature and studies wonderfully disrupt our classroom? So I hope you understand that disrupting is not meant to be a negative thing today. It's meant to be a good thing. It's meant to also be something that we think about more specifically, like how can we welcome that change and that interaction and that conversation into our classroom? So wonderfully disrupt our classrooms. Does Latinx literature favor certain stories over others? So the kinds of literature that we have available, do we perhaps have a certain kind of story that keeps coming up, backing up? And if you remember from last time too, we talked a lot about that, especially with Puerto Rican and Caribbean lit, right? Like there's certain kinds of stories that keep being repeated. Is there a canon of diverse literature? How might it reproduce certain stereotypes, right? Even in our diversity and talking about diversity, how are we still perhaps repeating stereotypes? And then as always, we're interested in combating anti-Blackness in Latinx education and communities, right? So when we talk about Latinx, it's not that we are excluding our Afro-Latinx community. Want to be very specific about that. And then how can we continue to connect, right, in the Lehigh Valley and beyond with each other about these topics? So I want to talk a little bit briefly about Latinx and what that means. And I'm a Latinx studies professor at Lehigh. So that's one of the things that I do for a living here specifically is teaching Latinx and what does Latinx mean. And I do use the X, right? So that's a decision I'm making as opposed to Latina or Latino or Latinat. I'm using Latinx. And that's something that actually started around 2015 that people started using a lot more. And it's about being inclusive of the gender, right? It's about different genders and not having people choose one or the other. So being inclusive of gender binary people as well, which is where that movement came from. So I use Latinx for that reason, as opposed to Hispanic, right? Because if we're still using the word Hispanic, we're really only referring to people who speak Spanish. We're not necessarily referring to, for example, folks from Brazil who don't speak Spanish, right? Not everybody who is in Latin America and the Caribbean speaks Spanish. You have indigenous languages as well throughout Latin America that still persevere. We want to make sure we're being inclusive and not just favoring Spanish and saying it's all about like the Spanish colonial empire, right? So that's one of the reasons we also use Latinx as opposed to Hispanic. Something that Latinx will always do, which is why it's disruptive as well, is that it's transnational. So a lot of our communities are still very much tied to their homelands. So it's not the same kind of immigration that perhaps we saw, for example, in 1920s and 30s, where folks immigrated and sort of like said, we're in the US and we're not going back. There's very much a connection always with our homelands being close to our borders, right, as well. And also the fact that, and I'll get to this in a second, that it's not just a product of immigration, but of migration specifically. It's not, for example, Puerto Ricans, which we've been emphasizing, are US citizens, right? The United States takes over Puerto Rico in 1898. So there's a reason why there's so many Puerto Ricans, for example, in the United States. It's multi-ethnic, it's multilingual, it's multiracial. Like, for example, Isamar and Jean Marie, who were here last time, talked about like the Asian immigration in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, Dominicans who are in different parts of Cuba, who are in Puerto Rico. So like making sure that we're being inclusive of what we say when we say a particular country or Latinx in identity. Latinos are going to mess up what we think about what is an American, especially since we use the word American in our traditions to really refer to North America, South America, Central America, right? So we're very inclusive of what that means for the different continents and how they're put together. So we really do change how we think about the word American And we have a lot of folks in Mexico, for example, who refer to themselves as Americanos. You know, they're just not Norte Americanos, okay? So that's something to think about too when we think about what is an American and how do Latinos change the way we think about that. Clearly, different kinds of migrations also mean, like I said, citizenship is going to vary. Some are born with citizenship, for example, Puerto Ricans. Some are right in the process of getting citizenship. Others believe that they are born in the United States and might be undocumented, but they're still citizens in their hearts. You know, so we have a lot of different ways of thinking about citizenship as Latinos, which is why the undocumented movement is really an important movement to consider, especially we have so many young people who have been brought to the US by, you know, parents and are in that in between stage, right? Class as well, you know, in terms of different migrations, race, gender, sexuality. We're not just one thing, is basically what I'm trying to get at. And I think it is important to remember that our literature is a product of US border crossing, specifically that the Southwest was Mexico, right? Puerto Rico is a colony. The US has the Dominican Republic twice, you know, Central America as well, which is a new migration, is also a product of U.S. interventions in Central America. So that's another reason why a lot of our young people are more and more from Central America. So it's important to remember that it's not just immigration, that it's also migration. Although a lot of our literature is definitely the Chicano story, right? The Chicanx story, the Puerto Rican story, so we might see that in our literature. And I know when I teach Latino literature, I have a lot of that in my anthology. I have a lot of Puerto Ricans and I have a lot of Mexicans. And our kids sometimes are like, pero, you know, like, what are, like, where, you know, where are the Dominicans? Where are the Central Americans? Like, what, how come it's just, well, something to think about is historically, those were the first communities, right, that we hear about in terms of folks writing in English. But as we continue to question new migrations, we need to be inclusive of those beyond those areas, but they certainly have had more access perhaps to writing in English in the US. We also have a lot of stories that are about like the urban center, like a lot of folks from New York, right? A lot of times we'll pick up a book and the kid is from New York City or he's from, you know, another urban community. So that's certainly something we got to think about. Not all Latinos live in New York City, although they probably should. No, I'm just kidding. I'm from New York, so, you know, I'm going to talk about New York, but hey, you know, we have Latinos in Texas. We have Latinos in so many places. How come that's not showing up in our literature, right? How come it's always this urban kind of story? And definitely thinking beyond festivals, folklore, and food. So making sure that we're getting stories that are not just about these ideas about culture as stagnant. Because, hey, you know, I don't wear my jibarita outfit every day. You know what I'm saying? I'm not always having mofongo. I might, but you know, I might want to eat a cheeseburger every now and then. So that we're not thinking of it as stagnant. And sometimes our literature does give us these messages of just this one way that people do things. So I want to make sure I say that. And then before Lorena comes on, I also want to have the invitation to let you know that as we're growing our workshops and in our next year, we are going to be starting more specifically discussions with teachers. So smaller groups where you guys can, you know, we can interact a little bit more than just like the big meeting that we're doing. So we can follow up with you more and discuss ethnic studies praxis in classrooms, teaching strategies, reflections as well. I actually have Lorena's book with me. I don't know if you can see it because the camera fuzzies out a little bit, but the anti-racist teacher, which has amazing praxis exercises in it to really think like, what does this mean? Like, how do I disrupt white supremacy in my classroom? What does that even mean? Like, how do I do that? So she has some really great practical tips, and we'd love to share that also in a discussion group, among other things. But definitely coming also in the fall, in addition to our Latino studies, you know, series, we want to start talking also about Asian American, you know, communities because of the responses that we've had, especially in our recent year of like, right, the anti-Asian violence that we've seen in our communities. Along with specifically the anti-Blackness, right? So wanting to remember that we respond to need and we respond to what's going on, and we want to make sure we do that. So we have some invited folks to speak about Asian American as well, which will be another series. So I just wanted to put that out there and let you all know that that's going on. I'm going to stop my share now. Hey there. Okay, so Lorena is with us. How you doing there, Lorena?
I'm okay. Thanks for
Okay,
having me.
chévere. I'm so excited. And this is our last one. I'm super relaxed right now, but it's one of the reasons I'm super relaxed is because I've known Lorena a bit. We don't often get to see each other. I don't think we've been in person like maybe more than once in our lives. But she's certainly somebody that I feel like I've known for a long time. And we've gotten to work together, especially with NCTE, which is the National Teachers of English, right? So a lot of her work in terms of what she's done in the classroom and how she's become a leader in our spaces and writing policy. She's obviously a very well-known educator, but she's also a kind teacher and kind person. And so I'm going to read a little bit of your bio before I introduce you, or actually by way of introducing you, which is on the back of your book. But it says Lorena German is a Dominican American educator working with middle and high school students in Austin, Texas. So you're coming to us from Texas today. While born in Dominican Republic, she was raised in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and she was where she began her teaching career. She has a bachelor's degree in English from Emmanuel College and a Master of Arts degree is from Middlebury Breadloaf School of English. And she has been published by NCTE, ASCD, Heinemann, National Writing Project, Ed Week. You know, I just saw recently a piece also in the New York Times about your work and also with the Disrupt Text group. So she is a two-time nationally awarded teacher. She co-edited the anthology Speaking for Ourselves, and she co-founded the Multicultural Classroom. So, and she's also the chair of the NCTE Committee Against Racism and Bias in the Teaching of English, which I super recommend. I might put it in the link actually in the chat for folks to read also. So she's also a wife and mommy, okay? So without further ado, Lorena German.
Oh, thank you, Marilisa. That was like so long. I feel like the main point is that I'm busy. I do absolutely more than I need to be doing. It's really the bottom line. Marilisa, I sent you the link just in case because it's acting up on my side. So hopefully you can share your screen and project for me. Maybe, I know it's last minute. And if we can't, then I'll just try to do it myself. But I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see so many of you and your faces, even if I don't know you individually, but it feels like this is a really cool place to just build with y'all. And what I want to do today is get into some convo about not just disrupt text in general, but specifically thinking about disrupting Latinx literature. What does that mean? What is Latinx literature? Like all that stuff that Marilisa just talked about. And then applying it to books and to literature. That's what I do, is talk
I'm
books.
not seeing a link. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I don't see,
Okay.
I'm not
A ver.
seeing.
I'm pretty sure, did I just send it to, yeah, I don't know. It's titled link to presentation, but I'll just do it from here. I was just trying to avoid having my computer crash on us, which we're just going to confidently move ahead and say that technology is going to work. Hold on, let me try to find it. But anyway, what I'll add too is that I'm also a classroom teacher, and I feel like that's really important to say, mainly because I think too often we have folks that come and talk to us, whether we're teachers or not, who are not in the classroom or who haven't been in the classroom, who and it's valuable to hear from folks also that are not in the classroom sometimes about what's going on. But I think that more often than not, we don't get to hear from ourselves, right? We don't get to hear from people who are in there just like us, dealing with everything that we're dealing with and navigating the same spaces that we are. So I really want to say that before I'm any of those things, a writer or, PD person, like I'm a classroom teacher, and I feel strongly about that work with young people. And when I do it with teachers, I see that as a classroom too. So I want to get into our topic without further ado, because I really want to get into conversation too. So I'll start by explaining what Disrupt Text is. It's for women of color educators. We're all teachers. And we came together because we found that we were having a whole bunch of the same conversations in different spaces, whether it was through NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English, whether it was, in other organizations and just at our buildings or with other teachers. We all realized we're We're talking about how to diversify our curriculum, essentially. And so then we just came together around that topic, and we started thinking and trying to identify what was our parallels, what is our goal when we're doing this work. And then we said, wait a minute, let's bring in other teachers to have this conversation. And so we created this hashtag, which is essentially a community, is really what it is. If you go onto Twitter, if you go probably at this point on any social media platform and you search that hashtag, you're going to find teachers that are talking about books. But now I'm very happy to say that we were able to get folks to understand that this conversation is not just about books, it's also about how you teach those books. And I'm going to get into that today. So Lorena, Kim, Trisha, and Julia, we started it. That's us. And you can visit our website, disrupttext.org, 2 T's. People get confused sometimes. And we've established 4 core principles to what it means to disrupt text. And I'm actually going to use that as a framework for today. All right. This is brand new. I've never shared this before. So Marilisa. But that's why I was really interested in this conversation. Yeah, because this is personal for me as a Latina. I'm Dominican. I was born in Dominican Republic, raised in Lawrence, Massachusetts, half an hour north of Boston. That's actually one of the spots outside of the island where you have a big concentration of Dominicans. So right after the island, it's obviously New York, and then it's Lawrence. So, where I'm from, we are the majority in every way, numerically, culturally, socially, but we actually are minoritized in terms of power, right? So even though that's been evolving, when I was growing up in the early 90s, that, it didn't look like what it looks like now, right? Our current mayor is Latino. That was never the case. He's our second Latino mayor in a city that has for decades now been predominantly Latino. So that's just one example, right? But all of that is to say that having this conversation today about Latinx literature means a lot to me. And I'm really happy to be able to have taken time out to think about it through a disrupt text lens. And so what I have here is essentially kind of like our purpose. It's to challenge the traditional canon in order to create a more inclusive, representative, and equitable language arts curriculum that our students deserve. Notice that this doesn't say switch out texts, because that's not the only thing that this is about. And that's not always the case. What we want to do is have a meaty, right? Like a thoughtful conversation about this canon that exists right now in middle and high schools. And we know that there's elementary ones too, like there's a picture book canon, there's all of that. But the 4 of us, our expertise is really at 6 through 12. And so that's where we center our conversation. And so we want to talk about books, but we also want to talk about practices. So our 4 principles are, well, I'm going to go through each one, but they are not linear. They are much more of a process. And it's important to say that because we are not trying to be prescriptive in start at number 1, then number 2, then we are not assuming that nobody has done this work or is doing this work. We are very aware that there is so much research that our own learning has rested upon and has built upon, okay? And it's important to say that, to offer credit where credit is due and to respect and honor our academic elders, if you will. And so, it's cyclical because you can jump in. We know that there are educators who have done number 1 and number 2 that I'm about to articulate, and maybe are just at like, how do I do that 3rd one? And so we invite folks to jump in wherever they see fit. And for those of you who are like, I don't even know where to start, great, we've numbered it for you, right? So we're trying to do all things as much as possible. So our first core principle is to interrogate our own biases continuously, right? So that when we walk into our classrooms, when we start the process of designing curriculum, when we're sitting there trying to pick a text, it is important for us to do that self-work. Before I say, oh, these kids don't know these things, well, what is it that you don't know? Or what is your bias coming in when you're thinking about that book? And so when thinking about Latinx Lit, we have to interrogate our own biases about Latinx identity, characters, authors, topics, literature in general. And Marilisa touched a little bit upon that. But, one of the things that unfortunately is our reality in this country, right? Because this is not the case in our home countries. Here in the United States, we deal with these stereotypes due to a number of reasons. Like how we got here is complex and layered. But the bottom line is that right now there are stereotypes in the ways that we are portrayed, whether it's film or music or books, right? So teen pregnancy is too often how our young girls are portrayed, right? That's like this big issue that, you know, your character is deep if she has to deal with teen pregnancy. Right? You've got these hardworking and absent fathers. They are a shadow, which is why for me, I get the whole thing about like, you know, let's wake up the sleeping giant, the immigrants, the undocumented. We're not sleeping. We're right here. And we may be hardworking, but we're not absent. That hard work for many of us is our love language in some ways. I am busting my butt off so that my kids can have and be and do, right? So there might be a physical absence, but that is not an emotional one, which is to that second point, right? These emotionally unavailable fathers, because they're always working and they're always absent. You have this trope present in so much of literature that features Latinx characters. Then there's obviously the overly, make pretend there's an L there, overly religious mother. She's super Catholic, and it clouds her ability to see her kids and especially her daughter. She just wants her daughter to also be Catholic like her and be a virgin, right? So you have these tropes, again, that are very limiting. They're limiting because I mean, we know how that stereotypes are damaging, period. But then also they're limiting because they don't allow all of us to be all of who we are, the wide range of our existence and our diversity as people who are from all these different countries, right? And then no Latinx book is complete without the immigration story. There's got to be an immigrant in there. You can't, it's not possible to read a book about Latinos where somebody's not an immigrant. You know, which I'm learning now that I'm in the Southwest, right, in Texas. I'm learning that there are folks on this land who were here before this was Texas. They're not immigrants. They are not, Americans are immigrants here, you know? And so that is also inaccurate, that every Latino is an immigrant. That's not the case. There's a lot of us that have been here for generations. And so immigration is far removed from those folks' experiences. There's always a gang involved youth somewhere or the threat of that, okay? You know, and then there's the Mexican monolith. There are so, you know, and it's not that Mexican literature is bad. I love it. I think there's so much power in listening to their stories as a specific nationality in this country of resistance, of fighting, of that, you know, espíritu. So I'm not anti that at all. And I know that as a Dominican reader, like if it wasn't Julia Alvarez, which I'll talk upon later, I really was like, I don't know who else is writing. And it wasn't until this other wave started to happen of Junot Diaz. And then we got like Elizabeth Acevedo, right? And I know though that there's many more, right? But they're not necessarily part of the books that are circulating our schools. But they are popular at the, you know, at the independent reading level, right? For adults. We know them, we talk about them. So that's a little bit of like the landscape in terms of the types of stereotypes that we need to be aware of, and therefore then interrogate our own biases as we're coming into our classrooms thinking about these books. Our second pillar is to center the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color's voices. And so here, you know, we have to center the voices and stories of all of us. There was research done led by Sarah Park. I think it's Dallin or Dalen, Marilisa. I'm not sure how you say her last name.
Dallin, yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. And so, you know, she has spearheaded this wonderful research. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but what I want to bring attention to is the lack of our voices. We are 5% of the folks depicted. And of those 5%, we are not all, it's not like 100% then written by Latinos, which is a problem in and of itself, right? So not only do we not get that much representation, and then when we do, it is not guaranteed that it is accurate, which is how we end up with these stereotypes. And so what I would say in terms of disrupting these books that we have in this Latinx narrative is that we need to consider texts that explore Blackness and anti-Blackness as part of the Latinx experience. We do not have enough of that in literature, in classes, just in general, in the books that are coming out. So that is a gap for sure. We need books that are by us and about us, not just about us, but also by us and about us. We need books that go beyond the Mexican story and beyond the immigrant story, that offer us a little bit more complexity. And by doing that, we're using texts then that build counter narratives, hopefully, right? That go beyond those stereotypes that we talked about, that move readers past this limited scope, this narrow view of who we are as a group. And so our third, I'm going through this fast just because I want to get to conversation. And I see that the chat seems like it might be lighting up. So I'm trying to get over there. And so our third point is that, you know, we apply and teach with and for a critical lens. So that's what I meant earlier about disrupt text is not simply about representation. It's not about having a whole bunch of Black and brown characters in books, but then how are you using those books? And for people who can't, for whatever reason, switch books and say, I'm not going to teach this super white canonical book anymore, right? Because it doesn't achieve what I wanted to achieve. Like some people don't have that choice. And so for those that don't, we're saying, okay, keep it, but interrogate that book. Don't let that book stand on a pedestal. Talk about what it's missing, talk about its gaps and its flaws. And bring in these topics, right? Even the silence of a book in and of itself. And just because Marilisa mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, I'll use that as my example, right? For example, one thing that is a super gap and lacking in To Kill a Mockingbird is that we never really, in a meaningful way, hear from Tom. We don't hear from Tom. We don't hear what it's like to go through that experience that he went through, to have to go to court, to then be found guilty when it was evident in the trial that you were innocent. And that is real life. Like that's what can happen. That's what's happening right now, right? And so that's a gap. And I would say, all right, we see this story. Let's look at this gap. Where did Harper Lee fall short? And that's okay to do that, you know? And so in the same way, you know, here are some questions. Maybe some of you might want to screenshot this, but here are some questions to consider to guide you as you're trying to do that. What is your purpose in teaching this text? So why have you chosen this text that features this Latinx character? What's your purpose? Why are you using this one and not another one? How will you students understand humanity better through this book? Notice that I said humanity. I didn't say how will they understand Latinos better. That might be part of your goal, but we're also human. Right? We're part of the world. That's basic, but trust me when I tell you that it's not always practiced that way in the classroom, right? What social issues that directly impact Latinos will this study touch upon? How will this book demonstrate our intellect as people, as this author? How is this book? How are you going to teach the Poet X? How are you going to teach With a Fire on High? And point out for students the craftsmanship that as Elizabeth Acevedo is achieving with this book. What deeply critical work is the text doing? What is it pushing back on? What genre conversation is it trying to have? What type of discourse is it introducing into YA or into, you know, general literature, okay? And then our fourth pillar or our fourth principle is to work in community with anti-racist and anti-bias educators, particularly ones that are people of color. And so here I would say, work with us, not against us. And what I mean is being super intentional about addressing those stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. Listen to your Latinx colleagues. They are probably already doing some of this work. For those of you that are not Latino right now, right in this room, I mean. Listen to your Latinx students. What do they want? What do they want to hear? What are the issues in their community that you might be able to use a book for to address? Listen to your Latinx parents and families. What are the concerns that your parents have, your students' parents have, right? What topics would they wish that their kid might learn about in school? Consider our sensitivities in response to historic school violence and neglect. For those of you that are Latinx in the room, you'll know, right, that there are certain cultural pieces that we bring as parents. Now I'm talking as a mom. Let me switch my hat real quick, right? When I am bringing my daughter to school, I am thinking, man, I remember what it was like when I was in school. I remember how my teachers didn't hear me. I remember how I wasn't featured in my curriculum. I remember, and I'm thinking, right, of all of this pain, sometimes associated, we'll call it baggage, and just healing that has never happened through schooling. So that when a parent is disengaged with the teacher or with school, I want us to interrogate that and reconsider that it might not be disengagement. It might actually be protection, self-preservation. So what are these parents and these student sensitivities in response to historic, right? It is documented. Schools have been violent toward Latino families and communities forever. And so, I really wish that we would be dedicated to our collective liberation. All groups, and because we're talking about Latinos, that's what I'm focusing on right now. And what comes to mind right now is the way that I'm thinking about the work of Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. And she talks about the racialized imagination and the way that our literature and media has helped to develop that and to sediment that. And so I think about that racialized imagination and how we have that as a nation and how it has led to the current systems that we have and how it is implicated, how literature, how English, how ELA, how our classrooms are implicated in the reality of a police officer taking his gun and shooting and killing Adam Toledo. I'm sitting with the weight of that. Is it my responsibility? No. Is it just ELA teachers at fault? Claro que no. But are we implicated? Do we have to stop and say, man, what role is my field playing in this? What can I do? What can I do and what can teachers do and what can my field do? What is in our hands? What is in our sphere of control? And the least that we can do is to disrupt the canon and consider welcoming in more diversity, specifically around Latinx identity. Since we're such a large and growing population, we're here, we're not going anywhere. We've been here. And so I'm thinking about the urgency of this work, the need for this work, particularly in the fact that we are, it sounds dramatic, but I can't help it. Like, this really is life and death. I mean, I'm not making this up, And so anyway, I'll pause here, but I'm wanting to communicate that this is not simply about, let me get a new book in my curriculum or on my library, but this is really beyond, And so we have a canon. These are some of the authors that everybody's got, right? Gary Soto, Sandra Cisneros, Pat Mora, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and more recently, Julia Alvarez. And there are so many more. And what I would push us to do is think about, well, of these 5, 3 are Mexican. Only 1 is from the entire continent of South America, and only 1 is from the Caribbean. And of those, none are Black. And I don't know, if we were to look into their books, right? I don't know how many of them feature Black or Afro-Latino characters. And that's a study to be done. I've looked a little bit through the curriculum in your district, a little bit, looked at some of the books. And what I would say is that there's some Latinx diversity. You definitely have a lot of those authors that I just said, right? There is definitely a Mexican overrepresentation, but because I didn't get into the details of it, I wonder, are there Afro-Latino characters? Is there a gender balance or imbalance, right, in these authors? And what are some of the stereotypes? Because we know that they're there. So I wonder, is there an overrepresentation of those stereotypes? Are there enough counter narratives so that those stereotypes don't become like the image, right? If after 4 years going to your schools, let's say 6 through 12, you're in there 4 years somewhere, all the characters that you met that were Latinx fit a certain stereotype. That's what the story that our curriculum is teaching, right? And by ours, I mean yours. that one in particular. I'm actually going to stop here, but I put this here because I'm sure folks want to, follow up and get in touch. That's where you can find me at the top. That's where you can email me, and then you can learn more and hit us up at Disrupt Text at the bottom. Visit our website, see what's there. There's a lot of resources that we've been compiling, more to come. But you'll find stuff there. So Marilisa, I'll stop here.
Okay.
And I know that there's a student who's gonna speak.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorena. And we're gonna come back to the convo because you started our convo, and you know we've been introducing this, but we do want to have a moment where a student speaks in conversation with you, and that's Alissa Flores, and she is our undergraduate student researcher. And if I just may hype her for a sec, she's a sophomore, but you forget, you know what I'm saying? And she's been in a couple of our workshops as well. And I just want to pass the mic to her. So you have the floor, Alissa.
Hi, everyone. So today I just wanted to share something I wrote with you. It's just about the importance of representation to me and redefining the canon, and also just like how I use art and specifically poetry and how this looks in terms of educational spaces and how those two can work in conversation with one another. So I went to high school in the Bronx, which is my home, with a bunch of other students who share the same grievances as me. Every peer I had was immensely creative and artistic, and it was just a matter of whether or not the art had been wringed out of us yet. You could hear it in the hallways, the echoes of people making music on the walls, singing ballads, dancing on their way to class. Everyone was telling stories through their art on a daily basis. But our art was permitted to the hallways, to our bedroom walls, to the back seat. It was deemed illegitimate, too crude, too loud, too risky. And it's all we heard until the universe felt convinced that we finally gave up on what we were meant to do. Educational spaces and artistic outlets do not have to be mutually exclusive. Art is educational, and art fosters the many important experiences of the many students that have it ripped from their hands. Students that are limited to rigid curriculums and are told their creativity is too much for their home, is too much for their school, and that their creativity and their stories are just too much. And I still recall the first time I got to present poetry was when I was a senior in high school. And this was many, many years after I first started to create my poetry, because again, like it felt wrong to indulge in my art and share my art, especially in a place like school. And it was a freeing experience. It was therapeutic, it was healing, and my peers felt the exact same. So just one day of poetry brought us all closer, allowed many of us to perform what we'd always loved, and allowed all of us to learn from one another. My mom often tells me when she sees a piece of my writing that when she was in her first and only year of college in a country that was just completely foreign to her, the silver lining was that her professor always told her that her prose was beautiful, that her writing was poetic and romantic, and that her writing mattered. And she came from generations of women who never had the opportunity to write, but who were just as passionate and who have this beautiful prose, but it just lies on their tongues instead of on paper. And I say this because it's meaningful that more than 30 years later, my mom tells me about the time someone told her that her art matters. And in college is especially where I realized that my poetry and my research work together perfectly. Like it was just interesting in a place like academia to make space for my art. And it felt like I was rewriting what it meant to be a scholar or what it meant to be an academic. And this is what felt most empowering in a place where I often feel like I'm an imposter. I'm testing the limits of what it means to be here. And in reality, there's no definition of what a scholar is, but there are implied measures of what a scholar isn't. And our art redefines intellectualism. Not only is it academic, not only is it scholarly, but it's revolutionary and it matters. And it's representative of generations of culture and experience. And our ancestors who tell us these stories and who reproduce the knowledge that we would otherwise lose, their voices are immensely important and they're intellectuals. It's storytelling that keeps our stories alive within something so permitting as academia. And storytelling is crucial. Like I said before, it's what connects us to our culture and to each other. And it fosters representation that is so, so meaningful in the formation of young identities. And when we put it in a box, when we force it to be something it's not, when we mold storytelling into a figure that leaves out the histories of so many, then we do it a disservice. And we do a disservice to the people who never see themselves in the books they read and the shows they watch and the narratives they're told. Representation is crucial. The first time I ever read a book in school that I felt like I could somewhat see me and my family in was The House on Mango Street. And I was already in high school, which means my 9 prior years of school, I never felt a personal connection to the stories that were being told to me. I did feel less alone in what I knew to be girlhood and in my identity as a Latina for the first time in forever, but yet it was the only story I saw myself in until college. Our stories have meaning, our ancestors' stories have meaning, and they deserve to be told. And maybe this means rewriting a narrative that's been told for generations. Maybe this means learning to hear silence, and maybe this means redefining what intellectualism is. What I do know is that it is most meaningful when we foster a place where people can see themselves in the stories they hold so close to them, and in the stories that we tell them matter, and those stories will forever stay with them. Thank you.
Wow, as usual. Reflect thereupon. So I always like to have someone who's an educator and also have a student voice, right, to kind of tell us about the different spaces that these stories happen in, and their impact ultimately. But y'all just went together so well. I'm so excited about that. But I'm sure we have questions, and definitely Lorena, I think, and Alissa also have given us some things to think about. Um, Even in this idea of like, what is Latinx and how is it represented? And to think that you could have your entire life in school and never even see a book or see it later on, right? Maybe even in college and never see it in your formative years. But what questions do we have? I know Lorena put some things out there for us to think about, Alissa as well, in terms of how could we even listen to silence? I'm curious about that, right? And the kinds of stories that are being told about our communities, but are still, leaving so much out. And what we would like to see also, perhaps. What questions do we have? I know there were a few folks in the chat that were writing about resources. I know you mentioned, Lorena, you mentioned the book, I think it was by Irisari, the Latinization book.
Yeah, the Latinization of US Schools is one that I was thinking about as Alissa was talking. Especially that first intro chapter. It just really offers a lot of context for the work that he did, but just, the way that Latinos are in schools. So I was thinking about that book too. And I haven't read your book, so I'm sure yours is also fantastic.
Oh my gosh.
So.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think one thing to think about too is, as teachers, how much time do we get to really do that research and to have that space to go to places like NCTE and learn more about like these, clearly complex, intellectual communities, right? So I feel like that's always something I'm trying to think about. And I know that not everyone has the opportunity to go to even a conference, for example, with funding and, all those different things. But it's also something to think about, that which is one of the reasons why we have these workshops, to offer that, to offer these resources and learn more about what's out there. But definitely, you also mentioned Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's book, which I put in the chat as well, if folks are interested in looking that up as well, that where you mentioned the racialized imagination. Other questions that people have or comments?
Could Lorena talk a little more about, so Vivian, with the Bethlehem Area School District, and we're in the process in high school of looking at the curriculum. But for some people, that's not fast enough. And I have to say, a lot of times that's me. but you spoke a little bit about what can be done when you can't just swap out books, because it doesn't happen that way. So can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah. So yes, one of the things that we talk about in Disrupt Text is kind of like there's different things that people can do, right? So there's the replacing. So we talk about strategic replacing, saying, okay, typically I use The Great Gatsby to talk about the American dream, right? For example, okay, well, are there other books written by folks of color who can, and if you have the autonomy to replace that book, right? Why would you replace it? Well, you'd have to figure out, what does it look like in conversation with the rest of your curriculum? Is the rest of your curriculum predominantly white male voices too? Then maybe that's an easy one to pull out, because there are so many other books by all kinds of people, right, that can bring a richness to the conversation of what this American dream is, right? So strategically replacing, considering, okay, I have many men, then I need to replace this book and consider bringing in a woman's voice, right? Or a queer voice into the conversation that my curriculum is having. And then where you don't have autonomy, right? Then you have to figure out, okay, well, I gotta teach these books. I can't replace Shakespeare's, Othello. That's the one they said I have to teach. And so then, I can talk a little bit about that and what it means to disrupt the teaching of such a book. And I'm being concrete because sometimes folks, I don't know, I just find that that's helpful to talk about it in very concrete ways. So when I think about, for example, Shakespeare's Othello, you can't have a conversation about Othello. You can't teach Othello without having a conversation about race and how it operates at the intersection of gender, right? Because what you have here is not simply a Black guy, but a Black guy that marries a white woman in this society at this time. And so, to teach that would mean in a way that satisfies, if you will, or that is aiming at a disrupt text approach, it would mean that as students, right, like I would sit with students and say, well, guess what? We're going to read this book and we're at a predominantly white institution. We're at a private school. What does it mean for us to read this book? What do we think and believe about interracial relationships? How does that happen here at this campus? So it's localizing yourself and your students, not reading it as this thing that happened a long time ago, but like, what does it mean for us right now? And then what biases are we bringing in as readers when we're coming into this, right? Then we would most certainly read it and do all the literary things that English teachers know how to do, symbolism, language, all the stuff. And then, like I said, have a conversation about race, which for me, the easiest way to do that is to supplement with nonfiction texts, right? So to have readings, articles that talk about interracial marriages, that talk about what it means for a white woman to make a claim about a Black man, and the way that has been literally deadly. What does that mean? What would have happened if Desdemona agreed with people because she succumbed to Iago's pressure that she was or her father's, that she was being bewitched or some nonsense like that, right? Like Othello would have been dead. So bringing that in, and that's how we listen to silences in a book, because the book is not, Shakespeare's not telling us that. He's not talking to us about that. That's what you're not saying, then now I'm gonna have to say, right? So that is how you would disrupt that. And I think that that's a much more responsible teaching of that book, instead of simply saying, what a great example of Desdemona, who's this anti-racist person. That's not the case at all. She never made any claims of that. She simply fell in love with this dude, right? So yeah, I mean, that I think that for teachers in your district who do not have the autonomy to replace, who don't have teacher choice, then how can I supplement? What can I bring in order to responsibly bring in the conversations and help my students make sense of this stuff? How can I help them to better understand what's really happening here, socially speaking, right? In terms of the larger issues in society. And that way they start to see these books in the real world and how they impact their real world, Maybe I answered your question. Maybe I went off. I don't know if I did. I think I did. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Do we have other questions that people want to ask
I'm seeing stuff in
specifically?
the chat
Yeah,
too.
me too. I saw something about online programs.
Yeah, that's what I'm, hold on.
Do online programs have more diversity?
Oh, okay,
That's from
hold on.
Karen.
Yes, I'm seeing all the things now. What about online programs? I don't know. What does that mean?
I can jump in if it's okay. I'm Kim Harper from the school district. So the curriculum we're moving to purchasing is primarily based online. So in the past, you'd get an anthology, right? And then your anthology was the one you had for like 20 years until you bought a new anthology. So one of the reasons we were moving to the online piece is because it is continually updated with more texts, and then diverse things are brought in. And then, for example, with everything that happened with George Floyd, the curriculum has a component of a current event piece. And then that was like the very next week, there was a topic on that the teachers could use for conversation and talking about it. So I think it depends on the resource, right? Everything could be static or it could be updated, and you have that opportunity. So I'm not sure if that's what Karen was getting at, but I know that was a consideration for us, the static versus the evolving.
I mean, I know last time we also had the question of like access to online, libraries and that sort of thing to bring in more diverse literature. And the reality of that, there's really a lot of limits on that in terms of what teachers can have in their classroom, even through the library. But that's interesting to think about, like to bring in a current event, right? And alongside, and I think that's something you're definitely advocating for, Lorena, sort of like localizing the text, even if it's Shakespeare, right? Like how can we, like this is still an issue, like these things are still shaping our world. But I do think, especially in our last year, it seems like that's been a struggle in terms of how to adapt curriculum or how to provide resources to really have these conversations in the classroom. And I was going to say, like, I guess I have a question, like, do you think that is something that sort of naturally arises from teaching, and sort of like the text, or is that something that you intentionally place in your lesson plan? Does that make sense? So is it certainly something that you plan to say, I would like to really have this particular conversation about this event that's happening, or that this issue that's happening in our news and that sort of thing?
Oh, I see. I think it's both, right? Like, and it's also nuanced, right? Like if I'm teaching right now in the district where the Chauvin trial is happening, might I have the conversation? I might, but it might also be that the kids are like oversaturated and they're like, no. So it just depends, right? If something has just happened in the news, the classroom might not be the best first place to have that conversation, right? Some of them might need to go home and have that at home and then come in, and then we can process together. In some cases, it's critical to start in the classroom so that they can process, because they might have to go home to people that they know oppose Black Lives Matter, for example. And so instead of coming home to have those conversations, they're like, I need to do it in my classroom where I can have some thoughts and arguments and resources so that when I can go home, I can have that conversation, right? So like, it's not prescriptive in that sense. And in the same way, my planning can't be prescriptive either. But I will say, Marilisa, that if the first time you're about to have a conversation and broach this topic with your students is because somebody just got killed, then you're probably doing it wrong. If I've been having conversations about all the issues, it's not one or the other, it's all of them, then saying, let's get in a circle, man. This just happened yesterday on the news. It's not an anomaly. It's not new. To me, it's not stressful. It's not, how am I going to do this? Because I've been doing this. I have the rapport. We've created routines and processes and space in our classroom to talk about it. So, did I make space and time? Yes. and all, but again, it depends, right? And I say yes because for the past 5 years I had been up at a predominantly white private school, rather progressive here in Austin, so that it was a good space for me to say, hey, we're talking about social issues. Kids didn't really push back. They were very interested and wanted to learn, and I didn't really have pushback from parents like that, which is a wild anomaly, I know. But yeah, I mean, in those types of situations, there were times where we were already talking about a thing and it's happening on the news. And so it felt very much like, wow, how, the timing. And I'm like, yeah, because racism doesn't quit. It's always on time, and these isms are always on time. So you're talking about them in class, it'll always reflect. And so I would appreciate watching them, or I appreciated watching them use their literary lens, that literary eye, to read what was happening around them too, right? And so it was a very tangible skill set. Like, I'm seeing it happen with this character. We can analyze it and we can do it in a way that's outside of me so that I can process and right, and see it in that way. And then it's like, oh, and there it is on TV. If anybody, for example, was teaching The Hate U Give this past month, I mean, you ain't got to do nothing but just keep teaching your book, because that conversation is happening already, right? If anybody was teaching any LGBTQ text and the rulings that just happened in Arkansas, like, you don't have to create space for a conversation. You're already having it. So that's part of why these topics and these books can't be a check box. It can't be like, this is my one unit for diversity, equity, all the buzzwords happen right now in the month of whatever this is, because it just, that's not organic, and that's not spread out throughout the year in a way that feels genuine and that feels productive. Bite-sized chunks along the way is so much better than all the pressure that you, even as an educator, would feel if it's like, it's February and Black History Month, and now I'm going to have my race talk. Oh my goodness. And you've got all this planning and you're out here fasting and holy water in your room to make sure it goes well. You know what I mean? Because if you've been doing this all year, then this is just another thing you're going to do,
I think that's crucial. I mean, I saw Adam put in, it's a restorative classroom. Many of our schools are restorative practice trained, but kids know fake, right? So if you don't make space from day one of school, or even before that, when you're, hey, you're gonna be in my class, can't wait to meet you. You're not doing it from then, and you try to jump into these conversations because, oh no, it's happening, I should talk about it, I don't know how to talk about it. And your kids are like, well, I don't want to talk about it with you because you didn't bring it up when it happened last year. You didn't, like, they just know that, one, you're being fake, or two, yeah, you're trying, but it's not, you're not comfortable doing it. So they don't want to risk either, because it's traumatizing to have these conversations for Black and brown kids. It just is. So you have to create that safe space before the conversations happen.
Yeah, Doctora Vivian, that's a really important point. All of that. And I feel like, even though, for some folks on this call, they might be like, yep, I get it, this is basic. It's, you'd be surprised how many people really don't know this. What for some of us comes naturally because we've leaned into it and because we've studied it and we're like, okay, I got it, boom. And you have your own flow and you have your own way. Like, that's just not the case for everybody. And then I want to add too, that if you're on this call, in this meeting, or you're watching this, it's also not to say, don't do it, don't start. Right? Like, if you're having your moment now, your aha moment, you're like, okay, I'm going to start now that the Chauvin trial is happening. Fine. But like, then don't stop, right? Don't be like, okay, it ended and it's May and now I got to get ready for the tests. And so whatever, right? Like, once you start it, you've got to keep going. That's the only way that this is effective, right? Think of it as a, like when you make a lifestyle change, you can't be like, that's it, I'm going to go ahead and just work out for a month and for the rest of my life, I will be fit. That's just not how that works. I wish, trust me. So no, right? It becomes your lifestyle, or it doesn't. And then you do a choppy job because you're always going back and forth. This is just, I don't know. It's an example because I need to work out. But I know someone, wait, someone said something in here that, yeah. So William Garcia Medina asked
Yes.
about, has it ever been questioned? So yes, which is very funny how that, not funny, haha. Funny, damn it. That kind of funny. So like I said, where I just was at a predominantly white, it's a private school. So we did not have to deal with TEKS, and we did not have the STAR exam. So it was a very privileged, because most private schools don't, which is a whole nother argument against standardized testing, okay? But I did get pushback, okay, from a parent, a couple of parents, for this class that I designed a talk called Middle School Social Justice, where we talked about all of the things. But I will answer your question. The question is, how do you deal with then the phrase, it doesn't align with TEKS or STAR? And I would argue that everything aligns with TEKS and STAR, or that you can make anything align with the standards, with whatever the state standard is. And so I would just do that. I would always, to cover myself, right? As I'm designing lessons, as I'm creating my units, I would responsibly say, okay, boom, here are the standards. These are the actual skills because the skills are not necessarily the problem. Right? The skills in and of themselves are not necessarily the problem. Sometimes they are, if they're very white centric, but generally speaking, right? Like reading comprehension. Yes, that's not a problem. We can all do that. That's a good thing. But teachers, I believe, should have training and therefore autonomy to say, this is the book that I think best helps my students, this particular group of students, gain reading comprehension, right? So anyway, all of that is to say, you can always make that argument, right? You can always say, I'm teaching this book. Oh, the conversation that you happen to walk in on today. Great. This is what we were discussing. This was the skill in TEKS and that we were addressing. And it's going to help with this, skill set that the STAR assesses. And for those that don't know, the TEKS are the Texas state standards, and the STAR is our state exam, our state standardized exam.
I have a few things in the chat.
Yeah.
And even with the conversation about like text by folks of color or Latinx, I mean, they could also be traumatizing to a certain extent, right? Like it doesn't necessarily mean this is the best book for this particular classroom. And it just reminds me of an incident we just had here in one of my classes where, not before we're free, when they see us, the mini series When They See Us, which is wonderful. But I remember students were just like, we don't want to talk about this, and I was just like, I know, but sort of like any lesson plan that anyone does with really material that is very difficult, and for all of us to be able to teach. And it doesn't necessarily mean that our young people are even going to want to engage in that kind of a conversation. So I just think it's really important. I see some comments in the chat about like, maybe a text that's considered sort of like canonical Latinx, and really like there's a stock photo in there, or, there's just so many different things that we could not intentionally, but not realize ways that it's really, going to produce harm, even if it is by, a person of color author, or, a creator of color, right? So ways that we can be sensitive in all those ways. But I'm sure there's other questions, and I know I'm seeing some. Anyone want to hop in here?
A question for Alissa in the chat.
Yeah, that's me. So Alissa, I was so moved by your story and your writing. And in particular, I want to hear you talk more about the intersection of scholarship and art, in particular poetry. I'm a 4th grade teacher in the Bethlehem Area School District, and I am locked into an ontology. So I find that writing is one area where I can allow the students to speak and tell their story. And in particular, poetry seems to be a venue, or just a way for them, I shouldn't say venue, a genre that frees them, takes away the rules and allows them to speak from the heart. So I just want to hear more from you about that.
Yeah, sure. I think for me especially, a big thing that I guess like me and all my peers were dealing with through K through 12 school the entire time was just that everything is so rigid and disciplinary, and it feels like we're constantly being put into our place, that we're not allowed to like blur the lines between our art, which so many students practice art. I feel like nobody really talks about that either. Like, at least in my high school, I feel like everyone had an artistic outlet, but there was no way for us to share it with each other than, like after school. And that becomes harder when you're in a place where you don't have like the resources to go and practice that, which we didn't at my school. So it was really confined to just like, like hanging out with your friends after school and sharing that with each other. If you, still had that passion, if it wasn't taken from you, because I think that happens a lot when you're told education is like the main thing you have to do. And like, there's no implementation of what you want to do. So that one day when we did have, just the time to share poetry with each other, it was immensely educational. We learned so much from each other, but we also, it posed an amazing outlet for every single one of us. And I'm really grateful that I found a place for art within my own research, because I didn't really make that connection for a long time, that those two things don't have to, be completely separate from each other. So I just think it's so meaningful, and it's been really meaningful for me throughout all my years of schooling.
Thank you.
I was going to say, and I think in terms of even when we think about 5% of the books are, Latinx, you put up that graphic, and, some of the experiences that Alissa is talking about in terms of erasure or not having a place for her stories or her family stories, or their kinds of storytelling, like how often Latinx understanding, ways of knowing, epistemologies, right, are not credited, or even are not yet written, or our authors maybe perhaps don't have the same access to publishing. There's so many different kinds of perspectives that I'm sure people can bring. But I was thinking about the data you put as well, in terms of 5% overall, right, of the books published. And you also said, not, and even that is not necessarily by a Latinx author. Could you perhaps talk a little more about like what you see in terms of the importance of it being authored by a Latinx community, member versus what we have available?
Yeah.
Lorena.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that I've articulated this before is with this analogy or metaphor. Yeah, analogy. It's imagine a mountain, and you have someone climbing the mountain, okay? And you have a helicopter watching this happen. Both of them have a story to tell, right? The person in the helicopter is very close. They're right there. They're like, look at that. Wow, I see the sweat buds. Look at their foot. Look at that rock, right? They're watching it happen, and they can give you a play-by-play. And it is, in fact, the vantage point. But it's not an authentic one, in that the person climbing the mountain is the one that can tell you what that felt like, what that was like, where they put their foot, what they thought, what they saw, what they felt. And that is the difference in literature too, right? Which is why the movement Dignidad Literaria happened when the book American Dirt came out, right? Because you have a story being told about us by a person who says is us, but then isn't, but then so like, which one is it? And you might be in that helicopter, and it's a vantage point. But unfortunately, there are already way too many stereotypes out there. I haven't read the book. I don't plan on reading the book. And, but this is, well, for a couple of reasons. One, I have absolutely too much to do, so I can't even read it. But also, because I've heard from folks whom I trust, who are authors, right? Who have talked about what it is like and how books like that have been pitched and denied publishing deals. And this one gets to go right through. And what they say is that there are so many moments as you're reading that book that you're like, this is super sensationalized. And it's very much like you're trying to put on a show. You're telling the story clearly, not from a person who's in those shoes, right? You are not the person being chased by this cartel. You're watching it happen, and you think it's really cool from the sides. And you're like, wow, it's a spectacle, And so we just don't need more of that. What we need is more authenticity in what is coming out. Because again, if we're trying to be anti-racist and anti-biased, then we're going to need to hear from the people themselves, right? So that we can understand them better. And that's that process of humanization. That's why I said that earlier. The opposite of racism is not love. It's not pro-race, right? It's not ethnocentrism. It's actually humanity. It's actually being human. What it takes in me to see you as less human is also dehumanizing for me. And that's really what racism is, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to be said for the value of us being able to write about ourselves, and the ways that we tell our stories, and the ways that we, not just because it's like good, right? It's like, oh, it's so much better that way. But it's also like, wow, I'm really growing in my sense of empathy. I'm learning legit stuff about this group of people or this person's story. And I'm able to take that learning with me and apply it in the world. But if I'm listening to that person in the helicopter, I might have some skewed understandings of what it was like to climb that mountain.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love the humanity part, because I have to say, I don't hear that much coming up even in our conversations about like anti-racism, and so much of what we've talked about, very rarely does that word come up in terms of like, that's really the counter, the aspect of countering dehumanization that has happened through a lot of these narratives. So I hope more folks will remember that word. I think it really I know it speaks to me in a way right now. I'm kind of spiritual right now. I'm having a moment. But I see a few folks that are actually in our audience that could perhaps also speak a little bit more to, and I don't mean to put them on the spot, but I might just to talk about publishing and own voices, movements, and that kind of thing. I don't know if Sarah Park Dallin actually is willing to say anything at the moment. Professor Dallin, are you available at the moment to say something? I had to do something.
Sarah, I was just
Hello.
messaging you.
I know. You and I were exchanging Twitter messages earlier.
It's a reunion, y'all. It's a reunion. Sarah Park Dallin, Dr. Dallin is a great colleague of ours. So we're just thrilled to have her here. And I'm low key trying to scheme on how to get you to talk to us more about the Asian American and children's literature in the future, but don't want to do that now to you. But yeah, in terms of conversations about own voices, authors, and publishing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're all familiar with the, I keep it here on my desk so that exactly for situations like this, the infographic about how diverse or not diverse children's literature is. I mean, I don't know, Marilisa, if you could find on my website, if you just Google sarahpark.com and then post the link so people can look at it and download JPEGs and stuff. But we didn't come up with this data ourselves. The CCBC at the University of Wisconsin-Madison puts together this data, and we worked with them to create the infographic. And, when we posted it, people were like, oh, but that's kind of that parody, because like half the children in our country are not white. And we're like, yeah, but like a lot of those books are awful. They're not written by people who have the lived experience of being Latinx or Asian or whatever category it is. And it's a problem. And Paula Chase Hyman, who's a member of the Brown Bookshelf, she actually did a little bit more research and found that the number of insider writers for the African American category had actually decreased over time, which means that even as more Black stories are being published, like they're increasingly written by white people and not Black people. And so when we see these kinds of statistics, we have to be really mindful of going deep and not just looking. I mean, infographics are really handy, but like there's so much more behind, like we actually, like if you look closely, there's shards of glass on the ground and the mirrors are cracked because we wanted to show that not all of the representations are accurate. And I don't know if this is a conversation we want to have now, but a lot of writers are pushing back against the hashtag own voices because it's being weaponized by publishers and editors and like policing identities and things like that. And so, my colleagues and I are having conversations about whether or not we should sort of go back to saying insiders and kind of reclaim that instead. And I'm interested in hearing what other people think, but some really prominent writers have said, I will never use the word own voices again. So that's been really interesting. And then Marilisa, I know you have thoughts about scholars, right? About when we are policed and what we get to say and not say about our work and the way that we are treated in academia, specifically children's literature, which is a tremendously white field, and when we are silenced and not able to speak. And the last thing I'll say is when members of our own community produce problematic books, right? Then what do we do with that? You know, we are not part of the publisher's marketing team, right? So we are not out here just cheerleading all of the books that are published just because they have Asian American people in them and are created by Asian Americans. But some of them, you know, because of like internalized racism or because of the pattern of immigration that brought them here at a later age, they don't know what it's like to be an Asian American child here because they were an Asian child somewhere in Asia. Some books can be really problematic. And I'll just go ahead and say, like, No Kimchi for Me, written by a Korean American. Like, I'm not promoting that book, you know? There's a line in there that says, "Arg, I hate kimchi." And I have a 7-year-old kid, and I cannot imagine anybody reading that out loud at a story time. And then some of the kids running around afterwards saying, "Arg, I hate kimchi, I hate kimchi." And, you know, I just can't with that. So we also have to talk about problematic representations that are produced within our own communities. Slanted eyes is another thing. A lot of Asian artists draw slanted eyes on Asian faces. And that's really, that is one that really infuriates me because, again, of the history of the way slanted eyes were used against us in political cartoons with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then also just throughout history, right, with like yellow face actors and Miley Cyrus, you know, slanting her eyes back. So it's everywhere. And we Asian Americans do not need to perpetuate that racism as well. So yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I don't know if that's what you wanted me to talk about, but there it is.
Excellent. Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I think it's helpful to have folks in the room who know publishing and have worked in these areas, obviously, in different spaces too, as teachers, educators, librarians, or with publishers. But I was also thinking, you know, and I think that this is for future conversations of, you know, even in our teacher workforce, right? The percentage of teachers of color is really, you know, not high, right? So we have a percentage of our students and our young people that are majority, what they call majority minority, and then a majority of our teachers are, you know, 80% or so, I think, is a white workforce. And I mean, I think it's important to obviously educate and, you know, think through and bring that critical lens. But I see a parallel as well in terms of how can we get more, you know, Black and brown teachers, right? And recruit and retain more Black and brown teachers who are part of those conversations along with young people. And I think that's a you know, it's a bigger conversation also because of different ways that has to do with like class and, you know, ways that our young people are taught to kind of say like, well, you got to go to school and, you know, go to business or be a doctor or whatever. But I know that that's also a pipeline issue, but definitely in terms of people even doing research, you know, as Sarah was talking about in terms of scholars, and even with Alissa, you know, in her work and as she's going through her undergraduate, I always say future doctor, I started saying future Dr. Flores. But, you know, as we grow into really thinking about retention of our communities in these different spaces, right, ultimately that is something that I hope we will advocate more for. Just to kind of think about the different systems, the way that these books come to us and how they're taught and who orders them at the library, how do they make it to the classroom, you know? But that's just like a larger conversation, I think, that we can just continue to think about. But I know there were a couple other questions in the chat did someone want to follow up here? I did put Sarah's link in the chat as well if you're interested in that infographic, which I think is really helpful. I know I've used it in my classes to think about, you know, who's getting published and why. And also to remember that even if we do have these representations, they're not perfect representations, right? As Dr. Dallin brought up and as Lorena as well, Herman brought up.
Marilisa, I don't know that there's any in there, but I do want to speak to something related to your point about teacher
Please do.
recruitment and teacher support. And it has to do with, like, it's a big conversation, right? Because there's so many pieces to the puzzle. In the same way that standardized testing is hurting our students, it's also hurting our adults when it comes to time to be a teacher. In most states, you have to pass some type of standardized test, and we are not doing well. And so there's that, right? Like, that's one of the obstacles to even recruiting and bringing teachers of color into the field, is all of this testing and cost associated with it. But then also I am very concerned about teacher recruitment, and I'm also very concerned about teacher education. I'm concerned about when we do bring them in and they are going to these schools, right, to get their certificates or whatever, or to just major in this stuff. What are they learning in terms of what it means to teach and what it is that we're supposed to be teaching? I have met plenty. I was one of them when I first started, thinking that, like, the more canonical texts I taught, the better, because that's where the skills were. That's where the quality texts were, right? That's what I had been taught, and that's what I believed, and that's what I did. And it wasn't until I stopped and realized after a couple times, like, what am I doing? What is this? This doesn't make any sense, that I started to interrogate this and did some of my own learning. But folks don't always have that space and time to process, right? And there are folks who have believed all the lies, that those are the books that are worthy of academic study and the ones that have literary merit. And I say lies because, are we really honestly going to say that no book from the continent of Central or South America or the Caribbean is worthy of literary merit, or that maybe just 5 of them from all of those places, right? And so I think that there is a conversation to be had in education where we begin to, or maybe continue to interrogate these standards that people have designed, these goals that we have designed, right? Like, who said that by grade 8 you're supposed to do this thing, and why is that developmentally appropriate, and what happens if someone doesn't meet it? Right? Like, are they all of a sudden on special education? Well, no, they just didn't meet it, or, whatever. So, like, it's really, I think, important for us to engage in that conversation, because that's part of the disrupting the canon conversation. The biggest resistance that we face with disrupt text is folks continuing to press and say that these canonical texts, that classic literature is where it's at. That's what kids need in order to engage in the world. That's what they're going to need to go on to college. That's where they're going to learn how to write better and read better. Those are the toughest books, right? And I'm like, well, have you ever even read Jorge Luis Borges? Like, do you even know one of those books? It kicks the butt of half of the canon. One of his books kicks the butt of half of the canon. I mean, so what is this really about? And so when we look at the canon right now, and we look at a visual representation, I'm going to pull up an image in a second and I'll share my screen again. But when you look at the visual representation of the canon, it is very much a white canon. Completely.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And even within our Latinx literature.
Okay. And if we're saying that those are the voices that are the best and that matter, and that those books are better than the rest, that is literally and by definition white supremacy. You're saying that this whiteness is supreme over other voices, over other narratives and writing. It is by definition white supremacist.
Absolutely. So I was gonna say, we do have a question too, I think, or a comment from William. I'm not sure.
Oh, I just want to say that I'm really inspired by the conversation today, and thanks so much for doing this talk. And I usually, I have, I'm not gonna make it too long, but this story I did share with Tanya Hernandez, who's a legal scholar, and she's interested in how Latinos can get away with being anti-Black or just race in general in the court system. The reason I'm saying that is because I worked at Austin, Texas. I was 20. I was very young. I was 20. 2012, I can't remember. Yeah, 2012 to 2013. So I was gonna get my alternative certification. I was finishing my first master's degree at the time. I didn't want to do academia because I'm a little more comfortable in academics now, but when I was younger, I didn't want to be around academics very much. So I was just like, I'm just gonna be a teacher because I think, you know, teaching is dope. And I was getting my master's in history from the University of Puerto Rico. So I passed all my exams to be EC6 bilingual educator in Austin, Texas at Riley Elementary. And so I passed all the exams, everything was fine. I was very young though. I did need more training for sure. So, and I was hired by the first day I got to class, I had 35 students. And then the 5th grade teacher that was there, she was taken to the 3rd grade classroom. So I was by myself, a first-year teacher with 30 something students. And then by law, she had to bring a substitute teacher. And in my mind, I'm like, why don't you just keep the 5th grade teacher that was already there? Because you have a first-year teacher, you know what I mean? And then they had to bring a substitute teacher, and then they come in my classroom like a month later. And then I got literally harassed by the principal and another teacher, Don Mexicana, they were from Brownsville, you know, and they started calling me ghetto. I called the downtown. I said, hey, I'm getting bullied by this teacher. And they called her on the same day to say, hey, there's a teacher called William Garcia who called you, and she forced me to get psychological evaluations. So the system, like when you go downtown and complain about a principal, they call the principal and they'll tell them what happened. And so then, they kept bullying. And one day I was talking to a janitor, say, hey, how you doing? I was like, yeah, I'm slicing and dicing. And then I get a cop come to a classroom and interrogate me. Sir, it's like, say, sir, did you want to threat someone or hurt someone with a knife? And I'm like, I'm sorry. Like, you said something about slicing and dicing. Clearly, it was my other teacher who, Ms. De La Torre, they were both called Dinora. Dinora de la Torre and Dinora Garza. And then and then she heard me, and so she was trying to get me in trouble, you know what she was doing. So then I was like, wow, okay. And then, they won eventually. I was like, yeah, because all I needed was 1 semester of teaching, and then I would have been certified to teach. So, because I paid by pocket. I was working for Austin International School as a receptionist. I was doing all this stuff, and then I told her, like, you know that the attrition rates for male teachers is that, like, you're not gonna, like, I need help. And then Region 13, they did nothing. And I just got bullied. I got called ghetto, and then, I'm like, she said, I'm like, what am I breakdancing in the hallways? Like, what are you talking about? But I was very young, and obviously I did need more training for sure. And then before I got kicked, I quit obviously because they kept going at it. I knew she was going to certify me, so I was like, whatever. And then I said, I need the documents of the stuff that you did, and then she called the cops, and the cops escorted me out of my classroom as I was teaching. And I looked at and I looked at my students like, I'll be right back. And I told the cops, I need to go through the back because, believe me, you don't want to escort me through that front door, the teacher with the parents waiting for their students. And so when we talk about, so that's what I was asking you about how, and the principal, she hated bilingual education. She was from Brownsville. She got her PhD in education after she did that to me. Dinora Bores, that's her name, Dinora Bores. And then como así light-skinned Mexicana, así Brownsville. And then
I just want to make sure, sorry, that we know it's 6 o'clock. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that, that for just to be mindful of the time, but I can stay on for a little longer. I can stay on for a little longer, but we sort of have concluded. And I just want to make sure that you get your moment, but I just want to make sure I don't miss in terms of other folks that might have to go, because I know Vivian has to go, and I know Lorena might have to go soon. So just letting everyone know.
All in all, in closing, it was a horrible experience. And then yes, like I kept doing education. I've been still doing educational stuff, but she went ahead and got her PhD in education, and then the other one became a principal. The other year who bullied me. And so that's why Tanya Hernandez was like, whoa, these Latinos can get away. And when I went to K, I said, it's anti-Black, it's racism, from these people. Like, oh, they discarded it because, like, oh, you're all Latinos, so that's impossible. So, and it was really interesting to kind of see, like,
it's certainly not impossible.
So that's just my experience with education and everything. So I just wanted to share that. I don't really share too much. I haven't really, but I just wanted to put that out there. And thank you so much for doing that. Yeah.
Wow, William. I know William also from different projects that we've worked on in the past in terms of his work also on Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latinx education. So definitely be on the lookout for his work. But I think it's amazing because you had an interaction there, and it's with another Latinx person, right? So how folks might say, well, there's no, I mean, racism, like, what are you talking about? But the different ways that like white supremacy reproduces itself, right? Whether it's a person of color, and certainly in Latin American and Caribbean thought. So I just want to make sure, you know, we always continue to have these conversations, and I know I just want to be mindful of folks' time too, because I know Lorena might have to get going and take care of baby soon. And but thank you all so much. I can stay on, like I said, for a little while if folks have just questions on the way out. But you all are free to go and keep posted with the workshops that are coming for fall, and we'll also be putting out some information about discussion groups and that sort of thing in the future. And Dr. Vivian definitely will be probably the person we work with to get that information to all of you. But thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your academic year and wonderful end to it. So stay safe in these COVID streets. I'm going to stay for a little while though, if people have just comments on the way out. But thank you so much also, Lorena and Alissa, for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who showed up and chatted. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Fabulous. I'll be right here. So if anybody just like, you know, it's like that teacher at the end of class while people walking out, I'm just going to be a good steward here. Mira, Alissa, did you press the okay, there you go.
Oh, thank you for reminding me. Okay, I'm gonna save it.
Just in case. Yeah. I don't know if it will go to you or if it will go to me, but I just want to make sure